So, welcome to week 3 of our series. We've been walking through this series that we're calling Got Questions. It's the idea that wherever you are on this spectrum of faith, from I'm not sure about any of this stuff, all the way through to no, I've been following Jesus for a considerable period of time, and I feel like I know my stuff. There's questions that may well come up. For some of you, that may be the sense of, I'm just not sure about this. I'm trying to believe, I want to believe, but there's these questions that come to my mind and they're hard for me to deal with. For some of you, it might be, I've jumped onto this following Jesus journey, but now there's this guy at work that asks me all these questions and I feel completely ill-equipped to deal with them. Questions come up regardless of where we are in faith. So what we said is we wanted to take some time to track through some of those. And this week, what I wanted to do is look at the idea of, does the beginning matter? The first words in the Hebrew Bible are Barashit bara Elohim. It simply is God in the beginning created. And it leaves it at that. No more details, really. It gives us the story, but it doesn't go a lot into the how, the mechanics of how that happens. It just starts as a faith statement. In the beginning, God was there. In the beginning, God was there, and then things. Questions? Doesn't it jump to your mind like, well, what does that mean? We hear all these scientific things. We hear about evolution. We hear about sort of the Big Bang Theory that we just looked at that little clip of. Like, does that kind of contradict what happens in Genesis? Do I need to believe that man was made on the 6th day of a 6-day creation to take the Bible seriously? All these questions can jump to our minds. What does Genesis mean to us? Is the beginning important? Or can we just throw it away as this kind of like, well, okay, that's kind of like old school thinking. That was before people knew that science was a thing. We're just going to leave that back there on its own little thing, and we're just going to work with the rest of the Bible. We want to take those questions seriously. For some of you, those questions may have been a struggle for a long time. For some of you, you may have been asked them at work. And hopefully, following this, you'll have some kind of sense of what is it that this writer of this book, Genesis, is trying to do. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and so it's the starting point of a story. The Bible is a story. In actual fact, for a book that's 66 separate books that has over 30 authors, that was written over a span of 2,000 years, that's written in 3 different languages, it is a remarkably coherent story. The start is that moment we talked about just now. It says God created. And then it goes on to unpack what God created. He created this world around us that we see, and he created people like you and I, but people like you and I that were made to be in relationship with him. But as the story unfolds in Genesis, it says that, well, somehow, through whatever mechanism, mankind and God that was supposed to be in this tight, simpatico relationship, it got warped. And so God spends the next couple of thousand years reaching out to this one family group. This one family group that starts with this guy, Abraham, who seems like he has this particular relationship with God. There's this definite move in Genesis 11 to Genesis 12 where it suddenly seems God no longer talks to the whole of humanity, but to this one family. And he says to Abraham, through your family, I'm going to reach everybody. And so he picks this group of people. But the problem becomes within this story that this group of people are actually no better than the other group of people around them. That they're supposed to be this light, this shining beacon, but in actual fact, they're just as bad as everybody else. And there's these cycles that they get worse and worse, and God does something to woo them back, and then they do something even worse, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Until ultimately, God says, I'm going to do something different, something that it seemed like he promised all along. He said, I'm going to come into the world as one of you. I'm going to live your experience, and ultimately, I'll die for you and come back to life for you. That Jesus moment is the moment where everything changes. There's something happening in this story, this inciting incident, a novelist would call it, this moment where, like, wow, everything now is different. And we are the evolution, the movement from that. That suddenly there's not this one people group that's defined by ethnicity. There's this group of people that are defined simply by coming into relationship with this person, Jesus, who came and lived and died and rose again. And this church period should extend to the point where God steps into this creation and says, I'm going to do something even bigger. I'm going to follow that with this renewed creation. This is this Bible story in just a few words that spreads over hundreds of pages, that was written over thousands of years by multiple different people. But what we're tapping into today is the beginning of that story. I don't know if you're like me, but I know instantly whether I am interested in a story or not. I know there's probably some of you that can pick up a book and be like, the first few pages were tough, but I finally got through it, and in the end it was rewarding. That isn't me at all. I am an instant switch-off person. If you don't grab me within seconds, I'm done. So think about things that you've read, think about movies you've seen. I would expect that the beginning was a significant part of that process. We've got some beginnings here, some famous ones. Here's Pride and Prejudice. For those of you that are romantics out there, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a young man in possession of a large fortune must be in want of a wife. This was written in a period of the importance of building marital relationships. In actual fact, Jane Austen, the writer of this, she wrote a whole chapter before this, and the novel absolutely died. It was called First Impressions, and until she cut that boring first chapter and started with this wonderful insight into married life, it didn't sell. But this was the moment where she got, okay, we got this. How about this one for you? When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would be celebrating his 11th birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. It's this moment where J.R.R. Tolkien, this genius on an epic scale, can create a whole world in just a few words. Suddenly, I, as a reader, want to know all about Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and I want to know what exactly will happen at his 11th birthday. Those beginnings of stories are essential. Think about movies that you may have seen. Sometimes the opening of a movie gives you a glimpse into something that you can't possibly comprehend now, but you'll grasp as you move further into the story. This is the opening picture of the movie Forrest Gump. There's a feather that floats gently down on the breeze. At the time, it seems insignificant. But what is significant as you watch the movie further on is that the feather somehow falls at the feet of the only man who would care that it landed near to him. You see this simple Forrest Gump character who will go on to do all these incredible things. Pick up this feather, place it into his Curious George book, close the cover, and put it into his suitcase. His simple acceptance of this gift that he takes as something that's come from above to him will be the reason that he goes on to do so many of the things he does. But when you look back, it's far more significant than it was at the start. Sometimes beginnings grab us because of the epic scale of what they're offering. Think about those of you that are old enough to remember 1977, the opening scene of Star Wars. Never had there been a movie that did things like this. This moment that this ship pulls onto the screen and it lasts forever is this moment of, wow, this is going to be amazing. Beginnings set the scene. They grab us or they don't grab us, but they often do more than just grab our attention. Often they're very important for what will happen throughout the rest of the book or movie. And Genesis is no different. Genesis is our starting point. So let's take Genesis 1 for a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read some of it. It's not going to be on the screen. You get to just follow along, and hopefully my words will create images for you. We're going to read down to verse 13. Then we're going to skip to verse 26 if you're following in your own Bible or you're taking notes, which you can on our new update that Jasmine very kindly put together. There's a little notes page and everything, so you can take your notes. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered at one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kind. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And then 4, 5, and 6 follow. 4 and 5 follow. And we're going to skip down to verse 26, where it says this. And then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male, female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. There will be yours for food, to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground. Everything that has breath in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array, and by the seventh day God had finished with the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from the work of creating that he had done. What do we do with a passage like that? Let's take a moment to pray, and then we'll share some thoughts on it. God, thank you for this book that you've given us, that you communicate through these words that we encounter. God, this passage raises so many questions for us. For some of us, we come from a real scientific background. Maybe that's what we've known our entire lives. For some of us, we come from a background where we were told repeatedly the world was made in 6 days. Wherever we are, God, this passage raises challenges. Help us to open ourselves up to what you might be saying to us, to listen for your voice in amongst it, to not come to it with prejudgment, but with an open mind. Thank you that you're present with us as we do this. Amen. So what to do with Genesis chapter 1? It's an amazing passage. But whenever you read a passage like this, you have to know that the author, the guy that put it together, was trying to do something specific. If you come to a passage like this expecting it to do what you expect it to do, you may not get the right answers. When you come to it expecting that the author is trying to do something, usually that can give you more of an insight into what the passage is trying to do. Genesis chapter 1 is a couple of things. Firstly, it's a myth. Now, there's just a chance that when you hear myth, you hear the wrong thing. You hear something like a myth is about Theseus, Achilles, the Trojan War, all these different Greek gods and things like that. That's not what a myth is. A myth simply means it is prehistory. What the author is not claiming is he was there to see this happen. The earliest traditions about who wrote this say that Moses wrote it. Moses was around about 1400 BC, maybe as far back as 1600 BC. In no way is Moses saying, I was there and watched this happen. So when you hear myth, what you hear is it's prehistory. It's not someone around taking notes. Moses has got this story from somewhere. On one level, someone might say God gave it to him directly, and that's okay. That definitely could be the case. On another level, you might say he's taken oral traditions that have been around for a while, and he's put them together to explain something about the world that they see. Genesis chapter 1 is myth. But Genesis chapter 1 is also poetry as well. It's also poetry. It has this kind of meter to it. It has this rhythm to it. Think about it. It goes morning, evening, first day. Every time you hear day in Genesis chapter 1, it's simply this Hebrew word am. And just let me give you a warning. If you love Hebrew language, you're going to get a lot of it today. So rejoice if you're a lover of all things Hebrew. If you're not, try and bypass the Hebrew and just move on with the English stuff. But it's important when you take a passage like this to try and track back into some of the stuff that the author says. And of course, he wrote in a completely different language to the one that we use now. So we're going to try and draw out what we can from that. The word om doesn't mean 24-hour period of time. It can. but it doesn't always. Sometimes it just means a set period of time, something broad and wide. But Genesis chapter 1 has this poetry to it. It has this rhythm, this meter. It's like ticking along. And any time you hear that there's poetry involved, that should clue you into something. It should clue us into the fact that some of the language we read might not be literal. It might not be literal. Now, it might be literal, but you and I have to be discerning enough to know the difference. Let me give you another example. This is Psalm 91. This is poetry as well. See if you can spot some of the literal, non-literal stuff with me. Whoever dwells in the shadow of the Most High will rest, in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. That is not Ephesians 2:10. Some of you may have worked out. It's Psalm 91. But look through that there. Look at the way that the writer plays with different ideas. Some of them are literal, some of them are not so literal. Perhaps when it talks about the shelter of the Most High, that's got more of a literal sense. He's talking about some heavenly realm we can't see here. But certainly when it comes down to the sense of He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence, there he's getting pretty literal. There was this strong belief in the Old Testament that God was able to save you from those things, that He, by His favor and grace, could protect you from dangers that you encountered. But by the time you get down to He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge, God does not have feathers. This is poetry. This is language that isn't meant to be taken literally. The meaning is important. The meaning gives us this new sense of who God is. He's this protective person that loves you and cares for you. But if you take this passage and say, I'm pretty sure that God is a large bird with feathers, you're way off base. We have to be able to take passages that are poetry and say, what is the writer trying to say? Genesis chapter 1 is this beautiful poem that celebrates God's creation of the world. As I said earlier, it begins with these words, Barashit bara Elohim. God in the beginning created. It doesn't seem like the writer is super interested in the how He created. He's actually far more interested in who, what, and why than he is in when and how. And unfortunately for us, some of the questions that we get most hung up on are the when and the how. We ask questions in church about, well, how long ago did all this happen? Did it happen 6,000 years ago? Did it happen 8,000 years ago? Did it happen millions of years ago? And the Bible chooses not to say. We want to know questions about the exact details of how God created. But again, the Bible didn't say. It says almost nothing about what you would have seen if you were on the ground watching this happen. When I was growing up in England, we had this thing that started called the National Lottery. You have something similar over here, and it became this huge deal. No one had ever seen that much prize money offered for a lottery ticket before, so people were going and buying it in their droves, and they ran this commercial with this huge golden hand that sort of appeared out of the sky and pointed down on the person that was going to be the winner and said, it's you. It was like this, I hope it's me this week. I'm going to win the lottery. I'll be a millionaire. My life will be miserable because I don't know how to handle that much money. But there's this moment of like, this giant hand appears out of nowhere. Sometimes I think when we read Genesis chapter 1, that's what we picture happening. We picture two giant hands appearing out of nowhere and doing all the things that we read. But the Bible actually says that God created simply from a word. There is almost no physical interaction whatsoever. It simply says God spoke, and it happened. The whole way of dealing with it is meant to keep us at arm's length, at least in terms of the how. Far more important are the why, the who, and the what He created. And God created this world that, according to Genesis, He said was very good. There was something about this world that He created that He loved. And there's a few phrases that He uses that I just want us to pick out and give us the sense of like this world that He created. So the first one is this. In chapter 12, He says that He created this world that would produce that would grow, that would expand. It's this Hebrew word, dashah. You guys are experiencing dashah right now. If you fertilized your lawn at all with the rain that comes up, it just grows back. It just keeps coming. You can cut it one day. Bob and Bob, the rock stars that cut our lawn every week for the church, they cut it one day. The next day, it feels like it's grown a couple of inches. It's that sense of like dashah. It's that moment that you look out at your drive and you see the weeds that have appeared through the cracks that you sure weren't there. It's dashah. It just keeps on growing. It keeps on coming. This is the world God created. It's this world of dashah. But it's also this second word as well. It's zerah. It's this word, this idea of seed and offspring. God didn't just create a world. He created a world that was endowed with this incredible energy. Think about the trees for a second. God didn't just create trees. He created trees that would go on to create other trees. There's this life in Genesis that doesn't just stop at the one thing. God didn't create and say, I'm done. In his creation, he created this sense of this thing will keep on growing. In the house that we owned in England, my wife and I owned some cherry trees, or a cherry tree initially. It was beautiful. The birds always got the cherries before we did, and they would drop the seeds everywhere. So after a while, we didn't have one cherry tree. We had about 80 cherry trees. But 80 useless cherry trees that grew so close together that they could never really produce good fruit. This is the creation that God says he created. Creation that didn't just stop and say, I'm done. Creation that would keep on creating trees that produce more trees. Think about your idea of Genesis for a second. Genesis talks about this idea of the Garden of Eden. If your picture of the Garden of Eden is one that's static and unchanging, then it's not what Genesis suggests. Genesis suggests this world that will keep on expanding, keep on growing, keep on moving. It was never static and changing, always dynamic and moving. God didn't just create trees. He created trees that would create more trees. And the pattern carries on through 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day, 5 day, until we get to day 6, which seems like this moment that God hits the pinnacle thing, this moment where something distinct and special happens. It says that he created people like you and I. He says he created them to be this word, to be tselem. It's one of those Hebrew words that's hard to pronounce because we don't say the tss sound anymore. It's like any of you that have been unfortunate enough to try and learn Welsh, they make sounds that we just can't make. It's like that guttural like sound, and it's just, again, impossible. Tselem is a Hebrew word that's somewhat like that. It's hard to get your tongue around. But the word tselem simply means image bearer. When God created people, the Bible says, he didn't create them to be just like the animals. He created them with this specific sense of reflecting him. The word has this connotation of being a mirror, this sense of like, oh, it's an exact replication. It's an image of this God that made the world. But more than just tselem, something else as well. He gave mankind this incredible role in his creation. He said that mankind would do this. Next one. I told you, the Hebrews coming. In the beginning, he called us to Miriam. You can skip on. There we go. Next slide. He told us that we would have these roles to play in this creation, that human beings were called to do this thing called radah, which simply means to rule. That you and I, when it comes to creation, have a specific part to play. Anytime in the Bible you hear the word kingdom, you hear it in the New Testament, you hear it in the Old Testament, what it means is the extension of your influence. So you guys, every single one of you has a kingdom. You have a house. If you are the head of that home, husband or wife, you have this sense of this is your kingdom. You have some measure of control until your kids get to about 13, 14, and then you realize your control slowly evaporates. But for the most part, at least in theory, there's some sense of control. If you have work life, if you have people that work for you, you have a kingdom. You have an extension of your rule. God's rule, theoretically, covers this whole world. But what he seemed to suggest in this early part of Genesis is this. You and I have a part to play in that. that when we do things, we are extending that rule. We are, in theory, expanding God's influence on the world, hopefully in a positive way. That is the role of an image bearer. We get to radah, we get to have dominion, and we get to do the next one as well. We get to kabash, which is just an amazing word. It reminds me of like big-time old-school wrestling, like I'm going to put the kibosh on someone. Seems like, aggressive, like I like it. But we are called to subdue that dashah thing we talked about, that growth, that constant growing of things. We're called to control it. That's what we do. We keep it in check. We take it and we do something valuable with it. Think about what that means for a second. For every instinct within you for this world, you now have an explanation. I am a sentimental person. I love innocent things and the idea of protecting them. I was the guy that, like, when I was in school, people asked me what I wanted to do and said, is there a job I can just go around protecting small animals? I'll do it. Like, I don't care about money. I'll just go and, if anyone's mistreating an animal, I'll protect them. Think about your intrinsic reaction to something small and innocent. I got some pictures of some nice, fluffy, innocent things there. Hedgehogs, the most innocent creature that you could imagine. It's this small pig-like thing that somehow is incredibly cute. Bunny rabbits, golden retriever puppies, kittens that can't roll over properly. Your protective instinct for them, your care for them, must come from somewhere. And I would suggest it probably comes from this idea that you are an image bearer. You are made to radah. You are made to have influence, dominion. You are made to kabash. You are made to bring this world into some kind of order. And your protective sense for those things is absolutely natural in those terms. Think about the fact that there's a group of people that will look at a landscape and say, do you know what? I think a golf course would look great there. I can see the 7th hole running down there, and then there's a cart path to the 8th tee, and then they see it in their mind before it's even there. It's radah. It's this sense of intrinsic to me is this sense of creativity. Think about Chip and Joanna Gaines doing their whole, like, I'm going to create a home out of a home type thing. It's that sense of radah. Think about the fact that human beings are the only species that wake up and say, do you know what? I'm going to change my bedroom decoration. I'm going to color coordinate my curtains with the carpet and the bedspread. No other species does that because no other species is intrinsically motivated by that radah. We are, the Bible says, that image of God. And when you and I do anything, we are doing that thing. When you're teaching a school, you are bringing that sense of order. You are helping with that sense of God's rule is expanding. When you are running a business ethically and employing people, you're doing that work that God has called you to do. In this terms, there's almost no job that you can do that you can't do in this way. There are definitely some when you think about it, but I don't need to call them all out for you. But for the most part, this takes your job and it makes it far more significant. This is what the writer of Genesis is trying to capture for us. What is our place in the world? When you read Genesis like a scientific textbook, it doesn't make sense. And when you think about it, that's perfectly normal. Supposing Genesis was trying to give us the science of how God created the world. Well, the question I would ask you would be which science? 14th century science? 21st century science? 2nd century science? When Genesis tries to become a scientific textbook, there's a whole group of people that it no longer makes sense for. What if we make some huge scientific discovery in the next 100 years, which changes our thinking about the way that the world came into being right now? Does it mean that Genesis no longer makes sense for those people? You can take Genesis chapter 1 and work very hard to make sure you align it as much as possible with the science of today. But what it means is that you have to accept that that text meant nothing to people that lived 500 years ago. It meant nothing to people that lived 800 years ago. And it may mean nothing to people that live 200 years from now. When you take away this desperate need to make science and Genesis align and realize that the writer is trying to tell us something important about who we are as a species, suddenly it makes sense for everybody. Suddenly it makes sense for everybody. tells us is this: you and I, we are God's masterpiece. We are made for a reason. And this is something that the New Testament writers will unpack as they move through their ideas. This is Paul, a guy that was a late convert to Christianity. He'd seen Jesus teach, wasn't convinced when he was alive, but was convinced when he came back from the dead. He said, we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so that we can do the good things he planned for us long ago. What that tells me is that you and I, somewhere inside us, the most important thing we can know is that God made us to be his image bearers. There's some fascinating parallel going on here, because this isn't the first book, Genesis, to talk about a creation story. In actual fact, there were creation stories all across the ancient Near East, and they actually have some remarkable similarities. Some of them use the same patterns Genesis does. Some of them have the same day format with these couple of huge differences. In almost every other ancient Near East story, creation and God are the same thing. So there's the moment that the sun is created, and in that same moment, the sun god appears. There's the moon that's created, and in that moment, the moon god appears. Creation, God, same thing, same sort of things happening with them. Genesis takes that and twists it and says, no. Creation is not God. Creation is something that God brought into being. God was always there. He is the first mover. He is the one that created this thing. And what I love, what is fascinating as a parallel is this. In all the other ancient Near East cultures, they had what was called temple dedication ceremonies. I'm going to borrow my plant pots over here, and I'm going to use them to create a temple. So what they would do is they would build this temple to one of their gods, and they would place it here like this. So you'd have the different pillars and columns, and it would look something like that. Probably nothing like that, but imagine. It's probably a lot bigger. But what they would do is over 6 and 7 days, they would have this celebration, this dedication for this temple that had been created. And in the midst of that, on the highlight, the pinnacle, the last day, what they would take is they would take the idol or image of the god, and they would take it and they would place it in the middle of the temple. So I've got an iPhone, which is the closest thing we have to an idol in today's terms. And say that in the middle, like what they would do is they would take it, and you'd have this moment of celebration where the idol, the god, moved into the temple, and it was the representation of his image, and everything that was like endowed in that god was now in that temple, and you could come and you could worship that god there. Think about what the writer of Genesis says. Suddenly there's no temple made of like a building. Suddenly there's a temple that is the earth. And in this final culmination, what he puts isn't a clay image, isn't a bronze image, isn't a gold image. In this one big climatic moment right at the end on day 6, he takes a man and said, this is my image, and puts him in the middle of the world and says, this is like you are doing my work here. In the same way that these idols reflected these gods from these other cultures, he says, I don't have any clay reflection, any bronze reflection. I simply have you. You are my image bearer. You live in this world. You Radah. You Kabash. You take my influence, my kingdom, and you spread it, and you change things. And only we as a species can do that. If you read Genesis as a 6-day creation story, I'm on board. I'm fine with that. But don't let that convince you that that creation was static and unchanging and wasn't supposed to go somewhere, because it was always going somewhere. If you read Genesis as this moment or this idea, this figurative language which is talking about how God used theistic evolution to bring about his creation in the world, I'm fine with that. But don't let that convince you that there isn't this moment where it says that God took this one species, us, and he said, you will be my image bearer in the world around you. That's our role. You and I get to do that. We are his masterpiece. Think about your own life in those terms for a second. Let's talk about just how God works in us to create change. I love the creative, artistic process. I love the fact that it takes an artist just this energy, this effort to create something. But actually, when you look at artists and how they do that, it can be massively different for different artists. Some of you feel like God has shaped you really quickly and really easily. Some of you feel like God is taking his time, that the journey has been painful, that you're still in that process of like, this hurts. Change can be difficult. The start of the 20th century is dominated by two incredible artists, Paul Cézanne and Pablo Picasso. Cézanne was one of the first post-impressionists. He moved art from that impressionist world onto the post-impressionist cycle. And Picasso would take that and he would run with it, and he would move from post-impressionism all the way through to just the cubism and the different ideas that he created, where almost you could imagine anything and put it down on paper. What I love about their story is how different their process was for creation. Cézanne took forever over his paintings. Sometimes he would do 3 or 4 of the same painting, and he'd love the first one and hate the fourth one. Sometimes he'd feel like there was a progression, but for him there was like this is hard, man. I have to get this painting out of me, and it would take him all of this work. Sometimes he would not even give them to be shown at all. He'd just get rid of them. Cézanne was this process of like, this is work. Picasso, the opposite. Picasso could take a brush and boop, 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 done. Never a second one, always an original, everything, boom, first time. That was how he worked. You see the same principle in music. There's an incredible movie about the life of Mozart. Mozart is this genius that has come on the music scene, but he is the scourge of Salieri, the court composer of the King of Austria. Salieri can't understand how Mozart's process works. He picks up Mozart's sheets of music for the first time, and as he looks at them, he sees that these are originals, these aren't copies, but there's no corrections to them. It's like Mozart heard the music in his head and just wrote it down complete. Salieri can't understand how someone can have a gift like this, because for him it is work, it is process. Think about Cézanne and Picasso for a second, or think about the works that they create. Both of them have this incredible value to them. They sell for millions of dollars. It doesn't matter that Cézanne's took all this work and Picasso's came easily. The value is still there. God is shaping your life into something. All you have to do is jump on board with that process and say, God, I'm in. I want to be your image bearer. For some of you, that process has been easy. And for some of you, it's been difficult. For some of you, it's difficult right now. There's moments, there's things in your life. It could be a family thing, a work thing, anything. But it feels right now like it's hard. Like this is like Cézanne trying to pull this painting out of his mind and get it on paper. For some of you, it's been a breeze. For some of you, it's felt like Picasso. There's this brush, and you feel like, man, God just changed me into something, and all is well. But that doesn't affect the value. You are his masterpiece, created in this world to be his image bearer. You are Tselem. You have a role to play. So I'm going to pray for us as we close. God, thank you for the message of Genesis chapter 1.